How does a nation with primitive equipment tame one of the most violent rivers in the world? Every few years, the Colorado River broke loose. Spring snowmelt and sudden summer storms sent walls of water racing downstream, swallowing fields and homes in their path. In the Imperial and Coachella valleys of California and across the border into Arizona and Mexico, farmers watched helplessly as their crops vanished beneath muddy torrents. The river's violence was not a one-time disaster. It was a cycle, relentless, unpredictable, and devastating. In 1905, a flood so massive it rerouted the entire river for 18 months, carved out the Salton Sea, and drowned nearly 500,000 acres of farmland. The losses climbed into the millions of dollars, a staggering sum for the era. Rail lines twisted, orchards uprooted, irrigation ditches erased overnight. The scars from that flood lingered for years, but the river showed no mercy. In 1916, another surge swept through, flooding 100,000 acres and wiping out an entire season's work. By 1921, peak flows at Yuma reached 240,000 cubic feet per second, enough to overwhelm levees and leave towns underwater. That year alone, 75,000 acres of crops were lost, with damages topping $15 million. For the families who worked these lands, the river's moods meant ruin or survival. Some years, the fields yielded enough to keep hope alive. Other years, the water came too fast, too high, and left nothing but mud and broken dreams. On average, flood damages in the 1910s and the 1920s cost $1 to $3 million annually, threatening the livelihoods of thousands. The river's power was absolute, and it was clear that unless something changed, the cycle of destruction would never end. Congress did not hesitate when the call for action reached Washington. In December 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project Act passed, clearing the way for an undertaking unlike anything the federal government had attempted. The appropriation authorized nearly $50 million for construction, a staggering sum in an era when the average American family brought home less than $2,000 a year. This was the largest single public works outlay the country had ever seen, dwarfing previous infrastructure projects and signaling a new era of federal ambition. Lawmakers and engineers alike understood the gamble. The government was staking its reputation and resources on the promise that one colossal dam could control the Colorado's fury, protect millions of acres of farmland, and fuel development across the Southwest. The Bureau of Reclamation, under the leadership of Commissioner Elwood Meade, took charge. The project's sponsors included the Secretary of the Interior and a panel of engineers who had spent years studying the river's moods and the canyons it carved. The commitment was total. Contracts would soon be awarded to private firms willing to risk men and machinery in one of the harshest landscapes in North America. The federal government was not just funding a dam, it was backing a vision to reshape the West, provide water for cities and farms, and generate enough electricity to power entire states. With the stroke of a pen, the challenge shifted from surviving the river's destruction to mastering it through sheer force of will and engineering. The full weight of the nation was now behind a solution as bold as the problem itself. Black Canyon offered no welcome. Early survey teams, armed with little more than notebooks and steel tape, stepped into a world shaped by violence and heat. The canyon walls soared more than 1,000 feet above the river, their faces black with ancient basalt and pocked with hidden faults. In summer, the heat pressed down like a physical weight, often topping 120 degrees by midday. The sun bounced off bare rock, baking the ground until shoes softened and metal tools burned to the touch. There was no shade, no breeze, just the relentless glare and the echo of wind whistling through stone. Engineers mapped the ground inch by inch, searching for solid footing in a landscape that seemed designed to resist them. Basalt, hard as iron in some places, fractured unexpectedly in others, crisscrossed by fault lines that threatened to shift without warning. Testing the rock meant dangling over the void or scrambling up scree, drilling cores to judge if the canyon floor could bear the weight of millions of tons of concrete. Each step revealed new obstacles, loose boulders, hidden crevices, and the constant threat of flash floods surging down the narrow gorge. With no roads, every survey instrument and water barrel had to be hauled by hand or by mule over jagged terrain. The river, even at its calmest, was a muddy, unpredictable force, churning below the cliffs that would one day anchor the dam. Field engineers kept meticulous notes, sketching fault maps and recording temperatures that warped the ink on their pages. The scale of the task was plain. Before a single shovel of dirt could be turned, Black Canyon would have to be measured, mapped, and somehow tamed. Freight trains began winding through the Nevada desert long before the first worker ever set foot in Black Canyon. The Bureau of Reclamation knew that without a steady stream of supplies, even the boldest engineering plans would collapse in the dust. So, as soon as Congress approved the Boulder Canyon project, crews from Union Pacific and the Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad fanned out across the Mojave, laying down dedicated spur lines that branched off the main tracks and snaked toward the future dam site. These spurs weren't just for show, they became the lifelines of the project, built to haul in everything from dynamite and cement to steel cable and fresh water. At the end of the rails, the real work began. Freight coordinators working in shifts around the clock orchestrated the arrival of boxcars packed with machinery, timber, and food. Each shipment was logged, unloaded, and sorted in makeshift yards carved out of the desert. With no roads and only primitive trails connecting the site to the outside world, the logistics team had to get creative. Barges and flatboats ferried the heaviest loads up the Colorado River, braving unpredictable currents and sandbars to reach temporary docks hammered into the canyon's edge. When the river ran too high or low for safe passage, crews turned to mule trains and early model trucks, inching along rutted paths that barely qualified as roads. The numbers behind this operation were staggering. More than 100,000 carloads of materials would eventually pass through these lines, each one timed to arrive in the right order: cement for the tunnels, steel for the cableways, lumber for the first shelters. Any delay could throw the entire schedule into chaos. In the heat of summer, rails warped and engines overheated, forcing dispatchers to stagger deliveries and keep the supply chain moving. Every bolt, barrel, and beam had to be accounted for. The freight coordinators worked hand in hand with engineers to ensure nothing went missing and that the right materials arrived before the next phase of construction began. This relentless flow of goods transformed the barren canyon into a hive of activity, laying the foundation not just for a dam, but for the temporary city that would soon rise to house thousands of workers. Before a single shovel hit the ground, the supply network had already conquered the first challenge, bringing civilization and possibility into the heart of the wilderness. Boulder City did not grow up by accident. It was drawn up on drafting tables in Washington and Denver, engineered as a living solution to a problem the government knew would come. Thousands of men and their families all chasing work in the desert, with nowhere to go but the edge of Black Canyon. The Bureau of Reclamation, led by Commissioner Elwood Meade, set out to build a model town from scratch, one that would be as carefully controlled as the dam itself. 6 miles from the construction site, surveyors staked out the city grid on a bare plateau. Streets fanned out from a central park, lined with rows of identical houses built to government standards. Each home had running water, electricity, and a patch of yard, luxuries for families escaping the breadlines of the Depression. Boulder City's planners insisted on order and stability. City ordinances banned gambling, alcohol, and even private businesses that might invite vice or unrest. The only saloons were miles away in Las Vegas, and the only stores were company-run, offering basics at fixed prices. Municipal officials appointed by the Bureau enforced the rules with a steady hand. Rent was deducted directly from workers' paychecks. Curfews kept the streets quiet at night. The police force answered to Washington, not to local interests. Outsiders, including jobless men hoping for work, were turned away at the city limits or forced to camp in the desert. The message was clear. Boulder City existed to serve the dam, not the other way around. The social infrastructure extended to every part of daily life. Schools, a hospital, a church, and recreation halls appeared almost overnight. Parks and playgrounds gave children a safe place to run, shielded from the dangers of the work camps. For white workers and their families, Boulder City offered security and predictability, an oasis in the desert, free from the chaos of the Great Depression. But for others, especially black laborers and minorities, access stopped at the city's edge. Segregation was enforced by policy, pushing non-white workers into makeshift camps far from the amenities of the planned community. By the time the first trains unloaded their cargo, Boulder City was ready. Housing assignments were posted, and streets buzzed with new arrivals. The government's experiment in social engineering had produced a town where every detail, from the color of the houses to the contents of the grocery shelves, was regulated. In this controlled environment, the workforce could focus on the task ahead, taming the Colorado River, while the city itself stood as a monument to order in a landscape shaped by chaos. Word spread across America like wildfire. There was work in the Nevada desert, and the pay was better than anything most men had seen in years. By 1931, with the Great Depression grinding on, unemployment hovered near 18% nationwide. For millions, the promise of a steady paycheck, 50 to 70 cents an hour for laborers, up to $1 or more for skilled men, was reason enough to risk everything. Trains unloaded men by the hundreds at Las Vegas, their pockets empty, their hopes pinned on a job at the dam. Some came alone, others brought wives and children, piling what little they owned onto battered Model Ts or boxcars. They came from all 48 states, but most were from California, Nevada, and Utah, places already battered by failed crops and shuttered factories. The lucky few who landed a spot with 6 companies incorporated found themselves part of an army more than 20,000 strong. For many, it was the first real work they had in months, maybe years. The jobs were grueling and the hours long, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. But even the lowest wage on the dam beat what most men could hope for back home. In those days, the average American family scraped by on less than $2,000 a year. Here, a determined laborer could earn enough to feed his family, maybe even send a little money back east. Desperation colored every corner of the camps and shanty towns that sprang up around Boulder City. Men slept in tents, under tarps, or in makeshift shelters of scrap wood, waiting for their names to be called at the hiring hall. Some waited weeks, others gave up and drifted away, but most stayed, driven by hunger and the slim hope of a job. The government's rules were strict. Only those with a work card could live in Boulder City. The rest, especially black workers and minorities, were forced into segregated camps, far from the comfort and order of the planned town. Still, the lure of a paycheck overrode the dangers. Men lined up for the most hazardous assignments, high scaling, tunnel blasting, river work, knowing that a day's wage might cost them their health or even their lives. Letters home spoke of heat that blistered skin, dust that clogged lungs, and the ever-present fear that a single misstep could be fatal. Yet for thousands of families, the gamble was worth it. The Hoover Dam offered more than a job. It offered a chance to survive, and for a few, to start over in a world turned upside down by hard times. Danger was everywhere on the Hoover Dam site, woven into every shift and every job. The men who signed up to work in Black Canyon did not just face long hours. They faced risks that could turn fatal in an instant. High scalers, the daredevils of the project, dangled hundreds of feet above the river, suspended by little more than hemp ropes. Their job was to chip away loose rock from the canyon walls, swinging jackhammers and shovels with one hand while clinging to the cliff with the other. A single slip, a frayed rope, or a falling stone could send a man plunging to the rocks below. For many, it did. Down in the tunnels, the air was thick with dust and the roar of drills. Crews attacked the canyon walls with pneumatic hammers, blasting out passageways for the river diversion. But even as the rock gave way, the air turned deadly. Gasoline and diesel engines pumped out exhaust faster than the primitive ventilation systems could clear it. Carbon monoxide built up in the darkness, invisible and odorless. Men staggered out of the tunnels, faces gray, lungs burning, sometimes collapsing before they reached daylight. There were no respirators, no warning alarms, just the hope that the next breath would not be the last. Heat pushed bodies to the limit. In the Nevada summer, temperatures inside the canyon soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In the tunnels, it climbed even higher, sometimes reaching 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat soaked through shirts in minutes. Water rations were never enough. Heatstrokes struck without warning, dropping men where they stood. The lucky ones were hauled to the surface, revived with cool water and salt tablets. Others did not make it out at all. Rockfalls were a constant threat, especially for high scalers and drillers. The canyon walls, scarred by ancient faults, shed boulders without warning. Even with the new hard hats commissioned only after too many deaths, there was little real protection. Every day, the crews faced a simple calculation: risk life for a day's pay or walk away and face hunger. For most, there was no choice at all. The danger was not just a backdrop, it was the job. Every worker carried it with him, from the first whistle in the morning to the last echo of drills at dusk. The price of taming the Colorado River was measured not just in concrete and steel, but in blood and broken bodies. A ledger clerk hunched over a battered desk in Boulder City wrote a name in black ink. The entry joined a growing list. One more man lost to the dam. Official records kept by the Bureau of Reclamation between 1931 and 1935 tallied 96 deaths. Each name stood for a life cut short. A high scaler dashed on the rocks, a driller overcome by carbon monoxide, a laborer drowned beneath a sudden surge. The numbers, though, tell only part of the story. Behind the neat columns, the reality was far messier. Oral histories from families and fellow workers whispered of more, at least 116, maybe more still. Some men died days or weeks after an accident, their deaths recorded as pneumonia or heat exhaustion, not as casualties of the job. Silicosis, a slow suffocation from inhaled dust, claimed dozens but rarely made the official count. Company doctors and coroner reports often blurred the line between accident and illness, and the ledgers reflected it. A fall from the canyon wall was counted. A lung destroyed by months of tunnel dust was not. The system itself made loss easy to hide. 6 companies incorporated, the contractor, paid out modest settlements for on-site deaths, but the families of men who lingered in hospitals or died off-site were left to fend for themselves. Many deaths, especially among Black and minority workers forced into segregated camps, slipped through the cracks. Their stories survived only in family letters, advocacy group petitions, or the memories of those who outlived them. The official memorial at Hoover Dam lists 96 names, but the true toll, men lost to falls, blasts, heat, and dust, was greater. Each number in the ledger stands for a gamble against the odds, a family changed forever, and a reminder that the cost of taming the Colorado River was measured not just in concrete and steel, but in lives that never made it home. The dam's legacy is built on their sacrifice, etched into every block and every shadow cast across Black Canyon. Steel teeth bit into the canyon walls day and night. The arrival of jumbo drills, massive, 3-tiered rigs loaded with pneumatic hammers, transformed the pace of excavation. Each rig carried a crew of more than a dozen men, working in a blur of motion, drilling dozens of holes at once into the basalt and granite. Where hand tools and single drills had once crawled through rock, these machines chewed forward at a speed that seemed almost reckless. In a single shift, a jumbo could bore hundreds of feet, setting the tempo for the entire project. Behind the drills, electric shovels swung into action. Each weighed over 100 tons, their buckets engineered to scoop out 20 tons of blasted rock in a single bite. These monsters worked in tandem with a fleet of dump trucks and rail cars, clearing away the so-called muck as fast as the drills could create it. In the tunnels, the shovels moved more than 1,000 tons of debris every hour, hauling it out to be dumped into the riverbed or used for the coffer dams that would soon hold back the Colorado. The numbers added up quickly. By the end of 1932, more than 1.5 million cubic yards of material had been removed from the canyon, a volume equal to a train of boxcars stretching from Nevada to Chicago. Operating this machinery required skill and nerve. The men at the controls of the drills and shovels worked in darkness thick with dust, the roar of engines echoing off the tunnel walls. A single mistake could mean disaster, a cave-in, a runaway bucket, a jammed drill that exploded under pressure. But the payoff was clear. With every load of muck cleared, the project gained momentum. The canyon's ancient defenses crumbled, and for the first time, the idea of bending the river to human will seemed within reach. The machines did not just speed up the work, they made the impossible suddenly feel possible. At first light on November 13, 1932, the Colorado River thundered through Black Canyon for the last time. On the canyon walls, teams of men, faces streaked with dust, nerves stretched thin, waited for the signal. Months of relentless drilling and blasting had carved 4 massive tunnels, each lined with concrete and wide enough to swallow a freight train. 2 tunnels pierced the Nevada side, 2 on the Arizona side, and their combined length was nearly 3 miles. Each one was designed to handle up to 50,000 cubic feet of water per second, enough to carry the river's full fury even at flood stage. The diversion crews had spent over a year underground, working in shifts around the clock. They drilled from both ends at once, attacking the rock from multiple faces to finish on time. When the last barriers were ready, the blast team set their charges and stepped back. A single detonation ripped through the Arizona tunnel plugs, unleashing the river into its new man-made course. Almost instantly, the Colorado abandoned its ancient bed, roaring through the tunnels with a force that shook the canyon. Above, steam shovels and dump trucks sprang into action. Crews dumped rock and earth from trestles, building a temporary dam across the old channel. Within hours, the river's natural course was blocked, and water surged into the diversion tunnels. For the first time, the floor of Black Canyon began to dry. The next step was to secure the site. Workers built 2 massive cofferdams, one upstream, one downstream, using earth, rock, and concrete faced with steel. The upstream cofferdam alone stood nearly 100 feet high and required over 700,000 cubic yards of fill. Pumps roared to life, draining the enclosed basin and exposing the riverbed. With the Colorado out of the way, the basin was finally ready for the foundation of the dam itself. The impossible had become real. The river was under human control, and the race to build Hoover Dam could begin in earnest. Concrete alone could not hold back the Colorado River. The dam's designers faced a problem that stretched far beyond the canyon walls, one rooted deep in the physics of concrete itself. As each new batch was poured, a chemical reaction called the heat of hydration began inside the massive blocks. The scale was staggering, more than 3 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a highway from San Francisco to New York, all destined to heat up from within. Left to cool on its own, the dam would have taken 125 years to lose that heat. Cracks would have spidered through the structure, threatening its strength and the safety of everything downstream. Material engineers arrived at a solution that was as bold as it was untested. Instead of pouring the dam as a single monolith, they broke it into hundreds of interlocking blocks, each no bigger than 50 feet square and 5 feet high. Into every block went a network of steel pipes, some as long as a city block, snaking through the concrete like veins. Chilled water, pumped by massive refrigeration plants built right on site, flowed through these pipes as the concrete set. The cold water drew out the heat, cooling each block from the inside out. Once a section reached the right temperature, the pipes were filled with grout to lock everything in place. This approach was a gamble. No one had ever tried to cool concrete on this scale before, but the method worked. By dividing the dam into manageable blocks and using chilled loops, the engineers cut the cooling time from 125 years to just over 2 years. Every pipe, every block pour, was a step toward turning a pile of raw materials into a single, unbreakable wall. The dam would stand not just because of its size, but because a handful of material specialists found a way to solve a problem that could have doomed the entire project. Schedules were not just targets, they were weapons. At Hoover Dam, every day gained meant less risk to men, less exposure to the river's unpredictable moods, and a faster path to power and water for the Southwest. The men in charge understood that speed was more than pride. It was survival. Frank Crowe, the construction superintendent for 6 companies, designed an incentive system that turned the project into a race against the clock. Bonuses were promised for each month the dam finished ahead of schedule. The rewards were real, hundreds of thousands of dollars shared among supervisors and crews if they could beat the calendar. This was no empty promise. Shift supervisors tracked every hour, every pour, every trainload of concrete. Crews worked in overlapping shifts, so the site never slept. Logistics teams kept supplies moving with military precision, and any delay brought immediate scrutiny from the top. The bonus scheme did more than motivate. It demanded coordination at a scale few had ever seen. Electric shovels, cableways, and concrete mixers all ran in tight formation, each piece of machinery and every worker locked into a relentless rhythm. The results speak for themselves. Hoover Dam was completed in March 1936, 2 years ahead of the original deadline. That early finish wasn't a fluke. It was the product of a system that rewarded speed and punished hesitation. The dam's leadership, from Crowe to the lowest foreman, proved that even the most daunting obstacles could be overcome when a workforce is united by shared stakes and real incentives. The early completion became a point of pride, a signal to the nation that American ingenuity and grit could not only conquer nature, but do it faster than anyone thought possible. Water and power, these were the promises that drew entire communities to the shadow of Hoover Dam. When the first turbines spun to life, electricity surged out across the desert, lighting up towns that had never known more than lanterns and candles. By the early 1940s, Hoover's power plant delivered over 1 billion kilowatt-hours each year, enough to electrify Los Angeles, Phoenix, and dozens of growing towns in between. For rural Nevada, Hoover's low-cost power was a lifeline, making it possible to irrigate fields, run small factories, and keep the lights on in homes that once went dark at sundown. The water held behind the dam's concrete wall transformed the Southwest. Lake Mead, stretching more than 100 miles upstream, became the main reservoir for the region. Its stored water fed the All-American Canal, the Colorado River Aqueduct, and the Central Arizona Project, irrigating more than 1 million acres of farmland in California, Arizona, and Nevada. Crops that once drowned in floods or withered in drought now grew in orderly rows, watered by a river tamed at last. Floods that once threatened to wipe out entire harvests became a memory. The dam's floodgates released water on schedule, protecting farms and towns downstream from disaster. Electric power, steady water, and flood control were the immediate returns on a project that had cost so much in sweat and sacrifice. For millions, Hoover Dam was not just a wall of concrete, but a promise kept, that the chaos of the Colorado River could be turned into something that served people, not destroyed them. Lake Mead did more than store water and generate power. Its creation transformed the desert, flooding canyons and valleys that had been carved by the Colorado over millennia. Entire ecosystems vanished beneath the rising water, replaced by a man-made lake that stretched 100 miles upstream. Fish species native to the swift river struggled to survive in the new, still reservoir. Along the shore, new plants and animals arrived, but the balance was never the same. Scientists later traced the loss of riparian habitats and changes in sediment flow all the way to the Gulf of California, where the river's delta began to dry up. Yet the dam's influence reached far beyond the local environment. Hoover became the blueprint for a generation of federal water projects. Its success emboldened planners to propose even bigger dams across the West, each one reshaping rivers, valleys, and communities. The model of federal money, centralized control, and large-scale engineering set a precedent for how America would manage its resources for decades. The ledger of Hoover Dam is not simple. On one side, safety from floods, reliable water, and power for millions. On the other, lost landscapes, altered rivers, and a legacy of decisions that future generations would have to reckon with. The question lingers, was the gain worth the cost? Nearly a century later, Hoover Dam still holds back a river that once seemed unstoppable, powering millions, irrigating fields, and defining the American West. But as drought and climate change push the Colorado to new extremes, the choices made here echo louder than ever. The dam stands as a monument to human will and a reminder that conquering nature always comes at a cost. What price are we willing to pay next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.